Why is the fact that almost all mass killers are men seen as an indictment of masculinity? That's the question the Tin Men poses, saying that you do not get to point to school shooters and claim it's fundamentally about masculinity any more than he gets to point to neonaticides and claim it's fundamentally about femininity, or that you can't do this and then simultaneously claim to be an expert. So what do experts say? In Healing from Hate, Michael Kimmel, a sociologist and academic, explored how young men get into and out of violent extremism. And Kimmel makes the point that gender plays a key role, asking us to imagine for a moment that those who drifted towards violent extremism were female. Would there be any other story? Would we not highlight the relationship between femininity and violence? And yet the fact that virtually every single violent extremist is male creates hardly a ripple. And we can be confident here that the answer is a resounding yes, entirely because George's point about neonaticides is a point that misogynists bring up constantly in order to paint women as more bloodthirsty and more violent than men. But it also ignores the fact that researchers do indeed treat this as a gendered issue, and began by developing a profile of who the at-risk population are. Neonaticidal mothers tend to be younger, teenagers, often still in high school, experiencing their first pregnancy and with lower levels of education. Due to their age, they're likely single, still living at home, and have often hidden their pregnancy from their family and the father, which plays a role in why it's almost entirely perpetrated by women. Neonaticide is homicide within the first 24 hours. The fathers are mostly not present or even aware the birth has taken place, which is also why it isn't seen as an issue with femininity as a whole, because when you zoom out just a little and look at filicides, then it's mostly perpetrated by men. Neonaticides make up only a small fraction of all filicides, yet despite that, we didn't deny it was an issue or try to argue that it was wrong to target women as the cause. Instead, interventions were designed and put in place based on the profile of at-risk mothers, such as safe havens, drop boxes, education for school nurses, and family planning education, all of which have helped to eliminate 2/3 of neonaticides. And in the same way, if we are going to tackle men's violence and extremism, then in turn we have to research and define the social, emotional, and cultural pressures that drive predominantly men towards violence, and accept the conclusions of that research, however uncomfortable it may be. Now, George tries to handwave away the problem of masculinity by pulling a quote from Michael Gurian's article, "Masculinity is not our enemy," saying that profiles have shown us the most dangerous male is not one who is strong, aggressive, and successful. The most dangerous male is one who is depressed, unable to partner or raise children successfully, unable to earn a living, unable to care for his children. The most dangerous man is not one with power, but one who feels powerless. But George pulls the quote too early because Gurian continues. Our culture has focused its media on the million or so males who have a lot of power at the top, but for the most part, forgotten the millions who don't. They are in constant fight or flight mode in a culture that has abandoned them. And every decade, we see their withdrawal from and violence against society and themselves increase. Gurian accepts this violence from men is increasing directly as a result of what they perceive as a failure to effectively claim the success and rewards they feel entitled to. And Kimmel agrees with Gurian on this being the root cause, but points out that masculinity is at the core of this angst, and is what drives and attracts these men to violent extremism. Men must prove their masculinity to other men, in the homosocial arena of other men. Their masculinity must be credited, validated, and affirmed by their peers. Historically, of course, they've proved their masculinity in the traditional, time-honored ways of their ancestors. In the workplace, as breadwinners, they've provided for their families, defended their homes, and protected their homelands. But take those roles away, and they need to find a new arena in which to prove their manhood. These men feel discarded yet entitled. Entitled not to be tossed aside. Entitled to what their fathers and grandfathers had. Entitled to feel like men. And if it isn't going to be given to them, well then by God they're going to take it. And take it from those to whom it has been wrongly given. George's problem is much like the quote he used, he stops short and doesn't follow the thought through to its logical conclusion. The reason that powerless men turn to violence is as a final, exasperated and frustrated way to enact their masculinity, to assert the power, dominance and manhood they've been unable to achieve any other way. In 2020, Brian Van Brunt and Chris Taylor published one of the most in-depth handbooks for helping professionals to understand the psychology behind what they call angry young boys who are driven to violence. It's important because just like was done with neonaticides, they detail the key risk factors for identifying men in the at-risk population. It also includes a scoring rubric for professionals to gauge and evaluate a person's indoctrination into harmful ideology that may signal them as being a potential threat. And they too identify the root cause as a lack of power and respect, viewed as entitled through the performance of masculinity. Men are promised things, sex, power, respect, they feel unable to attain, and often lash out, either through their keyboards or through other more direct and violent means. It leaves them with a growing sense of frustration, potential hopelessness, and despair that often leads to anger. This mixture of negative emotions, combined with the idea that they will never be enough, often leads to further alienation, depression, and the perception that they are frustrated, undesirable loners. This cycle, feeding upon itself, continues their spiral. And struggling with connection and relationships, these men build communities where they turn to each other for advice. But since that advice is coming from men in a similar situation, it just leads to more failure and rejection, reinforcing those false beliefs. In some extreme cases, the individual begins to craft a plan. This can be built upon a desire to finally be understood, to punish those who he blames for his unsuccessful life, or simply to make the pain of existence stop. These men then plan to go out in a blaze of glory, finally believing they will achieve the meaning and popularity that has eluded them in their entire lives. What Van Brunt and Taylor describe here is what we all recognize as the stereotype of a young male school violence perpetrator. Femininity isn't regained through acts of power and dominance, which is why masculinity is intrinsically tied to this violence. But they also talk about how to help these men, stating that by questioning and researching what makes men turn to extremist violence, we find opportunities to bridge the gap and pull these lost marionettes down, and instead help them to realize the actual path to becoming a real boy. The development of empathy, altruism, and caring for others. And this desperate need for viable and successful role models is also recognized by Kimmel, who explores how various deprogramming groups manage to turn young men away from violence and extremism. And once again, mentorship and masculinity is at the core of having an effective route to deradicalization. All of this means that to help these young men get out of extremism, we have to give them an alternative way to feel successful as men. They need to believe that there are alternative paths to manhood, besides either capitulating to their subjugation or violently rising up in defiance. They need to feel like successful men. And any program that promises de-radicalization must address gender. It must substitute new ways to demonstrate masculinity. One cannot ask these men to jump from their extremist views into a genderless void where they don't know any other way to be a man. The experts George wants us to consult are unified in agreement that these men are desperately crying out for role models and mentors to help them navigate how to find success, happiness, and contentment in a world where they feel discarded and powerless. And these people who claim to be men's advocates, who claim to champion and lift up these men, deny that these men even exist. There's not violent men, there's just violent people, ignoring the desperately isolated men crying out for relief. But non-gendered solutions to this violence cannot answer the existential angst at the heart of extremist violence. How can I be successful as a man? That answer can only come from helping those men to broaden their horizons, to open their minds, and encouraging them to listen to other, healthier ways of being. Otherwise, they'll continue to experience failure, rejection, and isolation, pushing them further and further towards resentment and violence.